Okay, good afternoon and welcome to a debate co-hosted by ECOS and Carbon Market Watch, two leading NGO voices in EU policy making. I'm Rome Zaidi and I'll be moderating today's debate on carbon neutral. Can legislation put an end to greenwashing? A big thank you to everyone who has joined us online, and a reminder, if you have a question or comment, don't forget to send it into the Q&A page along with the name of the panelist it's directed at, and we'll pick out some of your questions for later on in the programme, so do get involved even starting now. We'll also be doing two polls which will bookend our panel debates, so of course get involved in those as well. Now this week marks the EU Green Week, so we've decided to throw the spotlight on one of, if not the biggest environmental issue du jour, carbon neutrality, but specifically how the private sector communicates about it. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, to effectively fight climate change, we don't just have to reduce CO2 emissions, we must also balance unavoidable emissions with removals. This is of course known as carbon offsetting. Now, as companies or consumers, we should also be striving to reduce our carbon footprint by making more sustainable choices by the food we eat and the things that we buy, the places that we travel to, how we travel, our places of work, and the list goes on. But a big corporate problem is, of course, occurring where companies, and this is quite a bad one really, they say that they do more for the environment than they actually are. Let me repeat that again. Companies claim to do more for the environment than they actually are. This greenwashing is not only misleading, it's actually harmful. Let's now go to a quick poll that you can now, all of you, take part on Zoom. The question is, in a screening of websites carried out by the European Commission in 2021, what percentage of green claims were judged to be potentially exaggerated, false, or deceptive? So you've got three choices: A, 25%, B, 9%, or C, 42%. And while you're all thinking, what could the answer be? Is it really low? Is it really bad? Is it kind of average? Here's a little bit of background. And many of the websites examined in the survey use tactics that could be considered misleading and therefore potentially break consumer law. Potentially break consumer law, that's quite bad. And what they did was they made vague claims using things like words like eco, sustainable. They referenced natural products without adequate explanation or evidence of those claims. And here's something that is actually a really clever, but actually a really awful way that consumers are deceived. And I was thinking to myself, do I also fall for this when I'm at the supermarket or I'm buying a product in a shop? Brands use own brand eco logos. So they're not labels that are associated or affiliated or accredited with any accredited organization. How many times then have you bought a product and thought, oh, this says eco-friendly, therefore it must be, therefore I'm going to take that one. So that is quite misleading. And then lastly, they also hide or omit the product's pollution levels to appear more eco-friendly. Okay, so the answer is, if you're all playing along, the answer was C, 42%. I know that sounds quite awful, but also I hope that that also gives you a kind of flavor about the kind of discussion we're going to be having today. Now, how then do you counter the wild, wild west of unreliable green claims? Now, the EU Commission's Director General for Environment is looking at banning, they're looking at regulating, let me get that right, they're looking at regulating green claims, but could they also look at banning carbon neutral taglines? That's something that we are going to be discussing later on. Should they really be doing that? And is legislating the solution? Well, let's now ask the experts. Now, before we do hear from our panelists, let's set the scene with Gilles Dufresne. He's a policy officer at Carbon Market Watch. The NGO co-authored a study of 25 big corporations, and it found that nearly all of them, let me repeat that again, relied on loopholes or tricks to exaggerate their climate action. Let's find out more from Gilles. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. And good afternoon or good morning to everyone, depending on where you are. So I'm here to kind of set the scene for this event, and I really want to share a bit of our experience and thinking on this topic of greenwashing and corporate communication around green claims. We're an NGO specialized in carbon markets and carbon pricing, so that's very much the angle we're coming to this from, looking at what's the role of carbon offsets within corporate climate strategies and their communication. And I think about probably around 2 years ago, we really saw quite a strong uptick in interest for offsets, and with that also an increase in the number of advertisements and direct consumer-facing communication from corporates that involve the use of carbon offsets. And so we started looking a bit more into not only the quality of the credits themselves, so the quality of the offsets, but also how they're being used and what parts they play in corporate climate strategies. And what we discovered is that it's quite a complex and confusing area, to be honest. It lacks standardization and regulation. So companies are, to some extent, claiming pretty much what they want, based on a wide range of standards. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with initiatives like SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the Race to Zero. And these try to set criteria and guardrails to help companies implement climate strategies and also communicate in the right way about those strategies. But what we found is that even within those initiatives, there are still a lot of companies that are misleading their consumers about the real impacts of their green strategies. And so we've written quite a few cases and reports about this to showcase some examples that we thought are quite problematic. For example, you might have seen advertisements or press releases and media articles around carbon neutral fossil fuels. There have been quite a lot of deals involving LNG, so liquefied natural gas, where a company would sell so-called carbon neutral LNG on the basis of having purchased carbon offsets. So it would just be regular gas, of course, but because it's associated with carbon offsets, it's being marketed as carbon neutral, which is fundamentally misleading. To me, it's a bit of an oxymoron to present the fossil fuel as being carbon neutral. And as Mariam was saying earlier, we've also published a study that we did together with the New Climate Institute, looking at the climate targets of 25 of the world's largest companies with net zero targets, and we found that pretty much all of them, except one that we looked at, were lacking environmental integrity. And to just give you one last example, some of you might have seen already, if you're following this topic quite closely, you might have seen this morning in the media some articles about the 2022 FIFA World Cup that will take place in Qatar. We published a report today on the claim that this is going to be a carbon neutral World Cup. This is probably the biggest sporting events in the world, or among the biggest sporting events in the world. It involves the construction of multiple stadiums and hundreds of thousands of people flying all over the world to watch the games. And the claim that this is going to be a carbon neutral event is fundamentally misleading. The organizers are probably underestimating the emissions, especially from the construction of stadiums, and the quality of the credits that are being used is quite questionable. It's really low so far. So this is just one example of a claim that I wanted to pick here because I think it's really public facing. And so it's an example of a claim that is kind of giving the impression that we're on track to reach carbon neutrality, or we're on track to deliver on the climate targets that we have set, when actually this is far below what we need. And so this would be my takeaway message here, is that greenwashing is not a victimless crime in a way. It's very difficult to measure the exact impact, but advertisement does have an impact. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the multi-billion dollar industry that it is. And so we really need to have better regulations of it, and also better awareness among the public of what is behind those advertisements. And so I guess the last message, going more to policymakers and to regulators from our side as an NGO, is that we need to both better regulate the claims, but also be very careful in the establishment of new systems, of new markets that might open the door to more of those problematic claims. So I think we can do better in terms of the regulation and the enforcement of the existing rules. And with that, I will close, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the rest of the panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Gilles. So, I think, yeah, definitely the big takeaways from what you were saying, and for, as we debate this topic, is better regulation and really awareness by the public as to what they're being sold, essentially. But before you go, Gilles, one quick question. Junk carbon offsets, let's talk about those. I mean, they're a really big issue, aren't they? But they're not always easy to understand. So what is the biggest issue that's undermining the quality of it and trust in carbon credits at the moment?
I think the main issue is probably that the credits don't represent the full climate benefits they're supposed to represent. And there is this idea that every credit represents a ton of CO2 that has been reduced or removed. And that's the whole fundament on which the logic of compensation is built, that you can emit 1 ton somewhere and then purchase a credit that corresponds to a ton that's been reduced somewhere else. But the reality is that it is so complicated, and there's so much uncertainty in the measurement of the actual impact of those credits that in many cases, they just don't represent the full ton they're supposed to represent. And so in the end, a ton is not a ton when it comes to carbon credits. And the whole offsetting and compensation logic falls apart because of that, because then you're purchasing carbon credits, maybe it contributes finance to some positive projects, but definitely the maths don't add up. And so the many products and services that look carbon neutral actually still have an impact on the climate.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Gilles Dufresne, Policy Officer at Carbon Market Watch. Okay, well, it's time now to, of course, introduce our panelists of experts. They have, of course, been waiting by. Joining me for the debate are Bill Hare, CEO of Climate Analytics and member of the UN High-Level Group on Net Zero. He was also lead author on the 4th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Report. Welcome. We also have Christian Holt-Leitner, Head of Unit responsible for land economy and carbon removals at the European Commission's DG Climate Action. Welcome. We also have Robert Hetland, an independent climate advisor working with carbon removal and climate policy. He manages the Milky Way Climate Transformation Portfolio, which provides corporations access to an index of impactful climate projects, and we'll be learning a lot about that. And last but never least, we have Melissa Zill, Program Manager at ECOS, leading all of their work on climate change and carbon accounting. Well, welcome to all of you. And now to introduce yourselves to our audience and to let them know what your sort of take on this subject is. You now have about 1 minute to do so. Bill Hare, please go ahead first.
Oh, hi, look, I'm Bill Hare. I've been involved with the climate change issue since it all began, and I'm very focused on the scientific aspects of the problem, and in particular, the scientific rigor and effectiveness of the kind of offset schemes that we're talking about and the whole structure of how we get to net zero. So I'm really interested in this debate, and thanks for inviting me to join you, coming in from Berlin actually today.
Okay, thank you so much. Next to Mr. Holt-Leitner, please.
Yes, hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thanks for having me. Yes, and I'm one of the ones who try to do it better with better regulation. So in DG Climate Action, we are currently working on a proposal for the certification of high quality carbon removals. So we are working on the supply side. So how can we give a more credible, reliable certification of carbon removals, so to help all of those who want to invest in those carbon removals, be it a public or private investors. And yeah, it's one part of the puzzle, but it's probably not enough. I think I very much like also the reports by Carbon Market Watch, where there are a lot of good ideas on all the things that we have to do to support those companies who really want to make a difference on the road to net zero.
Okay, thank you so much. Next to Robert Haglund.
Thank you. So I focus a lot on carbon removal, but also how corporates best can contribute to climate action. And I think that's key to this debate as well, to sort of set off in that question. What can a company do to help climate, rather than how can they make an offset as cheaply as possible? And I think it's really key to see that the logic of trying to compensate for your emissions also is limiting, and sort of forces you to perhaps buy cheap projects and where you can't go and invest in more expensive carbon removals, for example, or in effective projects that are not part of carbon markets. But that's also what I'm working with. We put together a climate transformation fund together with the impact platform Milky Wire that tries to support impact for climate projects, but as contributions, so an alternative to offsetting, that just try to put impact first.
Okay, thank you so much. And then lastly to Melissa Zill, please go ahead.
Hello, Melissa Zill. I'm a program manager for carbon accounting and climate change here at ECOS. So about ECOS, we are an international NGO and we're a network of members and experts. And we advocate for for environmentally friendly technical standards, policies, and laws. So regarding standards specifically, my work at ECOS includes contributing to the development of an ISO standard on carbon neutrality. This ISO standard will be likely used all over the world to make carbon neutrality claims. But I also follow the policy proposals from the Commission on the certification of carbon removals, but also on the empowering consumers for the green transition, and on substantiating green claims. So today, in the context of the EU Green Week, we thought it was a good occasion for us to highlight the topic specifically of the carbon neutrality claims, because we think they are especially problematic and we want to also make a case for why they should be eventually banned through legislation. So the message is that those claims are problematic and misleading to consumers, because once they delay urgent climate action, but they also tend to reinforce the belief for consumers that their purchases have no impact on the climate. So voilà, that's it.
Okay, that's interesting that you straight away go straight for the jugular and say that you want them banned, not just regulated. And no doubt that's something that we're going to be discussing with Mr. Holzleitner. Okay, well, let's then kick off this debate. It's such an interesting topic, and I'm sure that everyone watching is really going to find it really something to, get your teeth into, and also something that you can finally understand, because, carbon neutrality is spoken about so much, but do we really actually understand it, especially when we're doing these mundane things like just buying something off the supermarket shelf? Okay, well, let's then look at some of those wild west greening claims. Okay, and this is something I want to ask just all the panelists, and I'll start with Bill here first. So is there such a thing as a CO2 neutral banana or carbon neutral coffee? And while you're thinking about that, what have you seen that has really, these company claims that we see, what claims have really shocked you? And then given that, if you are completely shocked, do you then think then claims such as carbon neutral or CO2 neutral shouldn't be allowed on the EU market? Bill Hare?
Yeah, look, all great questions, actually. In theory, of course, you could come up with a supply chain accounting to generate a carbon neutral banana, or even a carbon negative banana or something like that. So in principle, it should be possible to do that. In the real world, of course, what we see are things that aren't really working. And the European Commission survey is interesting. And I think that our own work and that of other organizations shows that most of the carbon neutral claims made by corporates really don't stack up, unfortunately. Not always because of malice or ill intent, but because of confusion and lack of regulation, frankly, in the sector. So I think it's possible. I think a lot of work needs to be done, and it's going to be one of the, I guess, issues that this UN high-level group is going to have to look at. I guess you asked me what is the most shocking thing that I've seen, and I guess I've been living back in Australia for the and had to deal with the liquefied natural gas industry. So for me, one of the most shocking claims is the claim that cargoes of liquefied natural gas have been shipped from Australia to Asia as carbon neutral. And these are using offsets, usually vegetation offsets and so on. And I found these to be borderline fraudulent, frankly, and extremely deceptive. And you step back a bit and you look around the world right now, and we're dealing with a huge outbreak of claims by the gas industry that their products are carbon neutral, and clearly they are not, and they're not Paris consistent. So for me, that's one of the most shocking examples I'm seeing. Shocking because it is egregiously wrong, and shocking also because at scale, these kind of claims could make it very difficult to limit warming to the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree limit.
Okay, yeah, no, definitely. You know, the things that you highlight from the gas industry definitely are really shocking. So, Mr. Holzleitner, to you then, you know, is there such a thing as a CO2 neutral banana? And what sort of company claims are you seeing that, you know, do shock you? And perhaps, as someone who is part of the commission, you know, the kind of things that you would like to see stamped out?
Yeah, I mean, I have a recent practical experience. We have now a special situation at the office, so we only have this coffee machines with these capsules. So I was somehow forced to buy one of those for the first time, and so I'm in front of in the supermarket of this shelf, and so then I see one brand that's saying, okay, this is a climate neutral coffee capsule. So I'm buying it without having really an idea. Okay, how can you make a coffee capsule a climate neutral? The coffee was good, so I then stuck with that brand. So it kind of worked on me. As I said before, I think we all have to do a lot of more work on that. So I think that for a lot of companies, and if you talk with the sustainability guys there, it's really a genuine interest to present to.
Just to interject there, that's actually quite fascinating. And given the job that you do, that you were also taken in by something as small as a coffee capsule. I thought, okay, given my job, I should somehow try it. But as I said, if you talk with sustainability managers, they are also in these companies. I think there's a genuine interest, and I think this is something that consumers also expect, and I think also investors to a large extent, that companies can present a climate neutral value chain. So a value chain that doesn't have a negative effect on the climate. And but we must get much better at presenting data, and there's a lot of education about this. And you both have to work on how you quantify the effects, and I mean the scope 3 emissions and so on. You need to get to a carbon accounting for the companies. But I think that this is something that consumers and investors are increasingly interested in. So we have to. You're not using the word banning.
Look, as I said, I'm not the expert on our green claim law. So there are other better placed on it. If this is the most efficient means, then yes, we should also be doing this. But I think it's really, we must give better methodologies at the hand how you can account for the carbon, and there must be much more education on what really happens in a value chain, and then also, to be honest, what is the effect of, if you plant trees, what does this bring for the environment? What does it bring for the environment if you invest carbon capture and storage? So there's a lot of work ahead of us.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's a lot of work to be done. I think your approach is quite good. It's a stable approach. It's an approach that we, of course, would expect from the European Commission, to give people and companies time. Robert Heggelin, your thoughts then? What's the worst sort of wildest claim you've seen out there?
Well, I think it's related to climate neutral oil, as already been mentioned. I think it's a good example, like, because then it's so clear that consumers can go out and, well, I can fill up my car. It's actually no harm done to the environment, because Shell bought some forest somewhere. But yeah, to go into what the others talked about, I think to have these kind of claims, I don't think it's necessarily the most progressive and best way to go about things, because then it limits you in what types of project you can support. But if you're going to make a claim, I think I would not ban them. I think you should be able to, and it's also part of net zero accounting. So if you can't make claims, then we have to abandon the whole net zero targets as well. And I just don't think the world is going to do that. But I think the UN Race to Zero and the SBTi has published good guidance. I was part of the SBTi working group as well on net zero standard, and there it's permanent removals that is required to offset fossil emissions. Race to Zero talks about like-for-like removals. So if you're going to offset your land use emissions, like from deforestation or maybe methane emissions, then you could use a more short-lived type of carbon removal, such as the reforestation. But if you're going to neutralize your fossil emissions, then it would need to be a permanent carbon removal that stores that away forever. And so if you have these kind of principles around what constitutes like a net zero scenario and what constitutes a claim, then I think it's absolutely fine. And the companies need to be clear about what they're doing and explain what they mean.
Okay, Melissa.
Yes. Yeah, well, probably the banana is a bit of a trivial example because it's so small. So offsetting the emissions for bananas to make them carbon neutral is probably not a big problem. The problem is when you, yeah, indeed, as many of the other speakers have said, if you start to claim that some fossil fuels are carbon neutral, then you run into the problem of the quality of the offsets that you put in front of those fossil fuels. Because if you emit a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere, well, it's emitted, it's there, and then to capture it back, that's where the problem is. Yeah, you can plant new forests, but the amount of CO2 they will capture is variable. Also, you know, in the case of droughts or forest fires, the whole forest can just burn down and the CO2 be released again. So indeed, as it was mentioned before, important to focus also on quality offsets and permanent carbon removals. And maybe if I can still add a few words about one of the most scandalous claim I've seen. It's probably on the entrance of a well, in a factory, a car making factory that claimed to be carbon neutral. So probably, yes, they offset the emissions of the site where the cars are made. But when you see this claim, you kind of associate the brand with a lesser impact on the environment, which of course is not true, because then people use the cars and drive them and fill the tank with fossil fuels. So, yes. Yeah,
and I think if you live in a particular country, you know exactly the one that you are talking about there, but we won't mention it. So essentially, Melissa, then, you know, from what you've said, from what the other panelists have said, there seems to be, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, a sense that companies think they can buy their way out of this by offsetting. So how much then do you think, and we've already spoken about this in you know, to some extent, you know, how much do these claims then really influence the decision making of consumers, whether it's that little capsule that you think you're going to take because it seems to be better for the environment, and then just how, you know, bad or harmful is greenwashing?
Question was for me, right?
Yes.
Yes. Well, the problem for me is when it starts to be a marketing argument or used in advertisement. I'm not sure if you're confronted in the supermarkets in the choice of different products, whether that will change something for you. But if you have a, you know, advertisement very widely shown in cities or on the TV, on the radio, mentioning the carbon neutrality of some of product or a company, that's where it starts to be more problematic.
Okay, and Bill, I can see that your hand is up. You'd like to say something?
Well, yeah, look, my experience is that there is a lot of confusion and a lot of damage being done by the disparate claims being made. And it's not just individual consumers trying to find a banana in a supermarket that's carbon neutral, or coffee, or anything like that. It also goes to many industry sectors that are trying to basically do the right thing. They may have chosen offsets, which I would say is the right thing to do, but and then they discover that the claims of their suppliers down their value chain don't stack up. So they start to run into reputational risks. They may have spent tens of millions of euros on trying to pin up their value chain carbon-wise, and discover that there are so many different claims out there that they're discovering that no one really knows what's going on. And some of their suppliers are being contested by NGOs or others. So I think it's doing a lot of damage, actually. And that's a kind of commercial damage. It's doing a lot of damage also to consumer confidence. And I mean, I'm just anecdotally aware of that, but I think that if you'd asked me 5 years ago, well, should this area be regulated, I would have not quite sure. But looking at what's going on now, and looking at the potential damage this is doing, also for the core issue, which is, of course, to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, and I think there's a really growing case for regulation and standards. We are quite used to that in our societies. Many things are highly regulated: cars, consumer products, you name it, it's got a regulation on it and a standard. And I think we have to move towards that in the same way that we've, as a societies, have learned to regulate the stock exchange and to regulate company reporting and so on, from laissez-faire through to now quite strong guidance on directors, etc., audit reports and so on, because we've learned the hard way. Otherwise, we end up with a bubble that blows up and hurts everyone. So I think that's where I'm beginning to think the system needs to go.
And so, Bill, then, I mean, you talk about regulation being possibly the best approach, or you think that's the way it should be now. So is that then the role of governments to put regulation in place to then end this misleading greenwashing?
Well, who else would do it apart from governments in a way? I mean, you could try private sector audit regulators. We've had experiences with that. And by and large, one way or the other over time, they basically not really work for different reasons. That doesn't mean governments are perfect and that they're not prone to influence by special interests. But I think governments also have legitimacy. They can also cooperate internationally. And I think that's probably where we need to be looking.
Yeah, and just Bill, Maddie Holton, she agrees with you, saying that greenwashing has a huge impact for delaying actual legislation, not just by confusing consumers, but also legislators. And companies need to celebrate how these claims improve their relations with governments by pretending the problems are being addressed. Okay.
Just to be the devil's advocate, like
yes,
you heard me debate around it, but I'm not sure how much like research has been done on this. Maybe there is, but I'm not aware of it on actually how green claims affect consumer behavior. If it leads to consumers choosing this or consuming more oil, etc. The theoretical risk is definitely there, but I'm not sure we have proof that it actually is very harmful.
Well, I think the VW scandal, the Dieselgate scandal, shows it's been very damaging. And okay, the company's begun to dig out of those issues now, and it's going electric, but I think that caused a lot of brand damage for Chevrolet.
Oh yeah. I mean, I just meant like, do the green claims cause people to consume more of like bad things, basically? That's what I was alluding to, if we have that kind of...
Good point, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about government. Let's bring in our friend from the European Commission then, Mr. Holderleitner. Is EU's EC, or European Commission certification mechanism for carbon removal then, by the end of this year, I believe, going to solve the problem then of junk carbon offsets? And if so, how?
It should be a stepping stone towards that. So what we want to do is we want to develop criteria that will show to the ones who are interested in financing carbon removals that this is a good one, that this is carbon removal that goes beyond business as usual. And what do we need for that? The first thing is the quantification. We need to get much better at measuring carbon removals. In particular, if you think about carbon farming, about the soil, there we need to improve still a lot. We need to get better information to the land managers. We need to better use the power of remote sensing of all the digital solutions that we have. Then we need a good baseline to say, okay, who's doing more, who's going beyond the current management practices, and we need to base that on a representative sample of comparable farmers. If we stay with the example of carbon farming, we need to be clear for how long the carbon is stored. So, and there it's very different with geological storage. When we talk about bioenergy with CCS, direct air capture with CCS, we have very clear rules with the CCS directive. So the one who stores is really responsible, liable for keeping the carbon in. Such a liability rule may be a big entry barrier for smaller farmers. So we may need there to look at different solutions, like more limited duration of the claims of the removed carbon. We need to be very clear on this for how long carbon is stored. And then on the environmental integrity, we definitely need to observe a do no significant harm principle. So we shouldn't have negative impacts on biodiversity, on energy use, on water. But we also want to give there a space to those that do also more for biodiversity, a space to show what they are doing more. So we are basically looking for triple wins for management practices, for removals that are good for the climate, good for the environment, good for biodiversity, and also make economic sense. And all of that can only work if we have a very strong governance system. And I think that should be third-party verification, as well as a registry for all the claims that come out of it. And we hope that that can be a first step. That will be a voluntary scheme for those who want to go beyond business as usual. And we hope that we can then draw from that a lot of lessons, and then see how we can take it, how the next commission may take it a step further.
Okay, I can see a few hands up, but before I go to the gentleman, let me ask Melissa Zill. So you heard what the European Commission could be proposing as first steps. What do you make of what Mr. Holzleitner says about the Commission's first steps to tackle this problem?
Well, certainly we participate in a recent public consultation about this certification of carbon removals. At ECOS, we are specialized in in standardization and all of these and the other voluntary schemes. We are a little bit concerned that if everything is just based on the voluntary market, the safeguards won't be sufficient. Definitely, our response to the consultation. In our response to the consultation, we really much would have preferred the governance of this new certification scheme to be led by the European Commission, indeed. So yes, we will get back to you on that, I suppose. Although I understand the complexity to set up a whole new system in such a in such a short time frame.
Okay, Mr. Hegland, I see your hand is up. Did you have something to add there?
Yeah, I just want to throw in that you also need to be careful when we create new kind of regulation and sort of standards, especially from such an official body as the EU. It can be much better than it is today, but there's also risks. Like, what if the EU had made this kind of regulation 10 years ago and said that you're definitely climate neutral, no harm to the environment if you buy these high quality avoided emissions offsets? It would have been doing some good, but then some of the fundamental problems with that markets would still exist, but it would be much harder to change it now and move to removals, because there would always be like a black on white. The EU said it was good, so it has to be. It would be hard to change. And I see some of the risk with early methods, like, soil carbon is poorly understood scientifically, if it actually does sequester carbon for how long. So if that would include it in claims, and then the science shows that it's not really working as well as we thought, etc. So I mean just the word of caution, it can be done well, but there's risks also to sort of cement things.
Okay, and then Bill, coming to you then next, what do you make of what the Commission could do, and what would you perhaps propose they should do?
Well, I guess I've become really skeptical about the ability to make these biological carbon offsets work. I mean, I come out from the old-fashioned mantra of real, additional, verifiable, and permanent, right? So to be real and additional, you need to have really good baselines for what would have happened in the absence of action. And the experience that's grown up in relation to biological carbon, forests, avoided deforestation, increased soil sequestration, and so on, is not good, actually. There's been numerous studies made which show it's not good. A long way away on the other side of the planet, in Australia recently, the chief regulator, former regulator of the Australian carbon system, came out and said they're essentially fraudulent. As their own regulator said they're fraudulent. Why? And that gets to the real and additional part of it, that the baselines for deforestation or for carbon uptake were basically manipulated, so that 80% of the units were invalid. And you know what? I'm not really sure that's a technical problem. I think it's a really, really fundamental problem with this space. Particularly in relation to land carbon. Yes, by all means, we need to get the measuring better and all that stuff. But the other aspect of this is permanence. You know, as a climate scientist, I know that you put a ton of carbon in the atmosphere from a geological repository of fossil fuel. A fair fraction that's going to still be there in 100 and a few thousand years, right? And to genuinely offset that, you would have to be sure that the carbon you've taken out has compensated for all the geophysical aspects of that problem, and over an indefinite time period. And we're presently not able to guarantee that. So I think that's partly where I'm coming from. I'm very skeptical about this approach in general. And I think a very interesting report was published by the colleagues from the New Climate Institute, which emphasize that if you're going to focus on this, you need to focus on measures that lead to transformational change in companies. So you need to focus on providing opportunities for companies to take action that leads to really transformational change in their sectors or in related sectors. And I think that's another perhaps design criteria one needs to look at in devising the system that we're implicitly talking about.
Okay, Mr. Holzleitner, your sort of thoughts then on what you've heard?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what I would hope that our certification standards can do, that they can change the value chain. For me, carbon removal is not necessarily offsetting. We need to get better in managing, like our land. We need to get better at managing how much carbon we store in our products, bioplastics, and so on. We need to get ready for a world without fossil carbon. We need to get better at direct air capture, whether we then store it geologically or whether we use the captured carbon for other purposes. We produce proteins out of it or whatever there could be in the future. So what we are doing here is a very first step. And I would hope that a lot of the applications we will see within the value chains of companies, so that it will help food processors, food processing companies to better manage their Scope 3 emissions. They already have incentive contracts with their suppliers. It would be great if they put in also a carbon element. And it's clear in the beginning, it may be about a certain change in management practices, and we should be very clear that this only changes maybe the soil carbon for the time that this management practice is done, and this will never be a permanent removal as can be done with a geological storage. But despite all of these challenges, it shouldn't stop us from also developing a policy on how we can increase carbon removals, how we can get better on that, how we can get better at managing our land. And there are a lot of guys active in this on regenerative agriculture with a lot of good ideas, and we should give them a stage and method how they can show that. And and for me, that would be a very first stepper in the same way as we started with just measuring emissions in the early 2000s. Whatever will be afterwards, the financial incentives that we will build on that. I have a very open mind, and there are very different views here in Brussels, from a separate carbon removal target to public financing, common agricultural policy, or what I also find very interesting, what Sweden is doing with a reversed auction for carbon removals. So there are a lot of ideas out there on how you can better than finance those additional carbon removals. And I want to keep a very open mind on that. But whatever you do in that space, the first thing is you need to be better at monitoring, at certifying them, at getting more credible there. And I think this is pretty much what we want to do with this initiative, which is a first step.
Okay, and Mr. Hägglund, I know that you want me to come to you next. So you're hearing there about Scope 3 emissions, and before you answer to what you just had there's also a question from the chat where someone says, how can a well-meaning company deal with its indirect, so Scope 3 emissions? Is there space for offsetting, and what else could be done? But please, your reaction then.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a quick reaction. I think it's so crucial what you're saying, that carbon removal is not only offsetting, and carbon credits is not only offsetting either. It depends on why you're doing it and what kind of claims you're making. So, and a lot of these solutions like regenerative agriculture should be done for other benefits, right? And be incentivized regardless if they store carbon or not. So to have these kind of mechanisms going where you do reward solutions that also store carbon, but not necessarily as part of offset claims. I think it's crucial, but then it wouldn't be part of the claims, etc. Of course, it would be a different claim rather than neutrality. So we're happy to talk about the other question too, but maybe you want to bring someone else in.
I think Bill's hand is up, or is Bill your hand permanently up? I'm not quite sure, but we'll come to you then. Maybe you have a reaction.
Hand is not permanently up, but look, I think it was very interesting points by Christian. I'll come to the Scope 3 issue in a minute. I think the idea of a separate target for removals is interesting. It's been talked about for the time in the scientific community, I think first more than 20 odd years ago, and it's really worth having a look at how that might work, because that might be a way of getting over some of the issues that I've raised, for example, about this. And of course, you're absolutely right, and Robert is absolutely right, that you need to improve carbon storage for a whole lot of reasons outside any offsetting imperatives. And that's really important to remember. On Scope 3, it's a difficult problem, but just to refer to a few leading edge examples, and we know that one of the big iron ore exporters from Australia, Fortescue Minerals, is now proposing to actually clean up their product from beginning to end, Scope 1 all the way through to delivery of iron ore or iron ingots or whatever to markets in Asia. In other words, the company's proposing to take responsibility for the lot. And there are other companies talking about that. I know there's a car company now that's putting a car out there on the market that they claim, is basically going to be taken care of all the way through its life cycle, including the Scope 3 emissions from the use of the vehicle. So maybe that is something to really think about in terms of if a company is producing a product with large Scope 3 emissions, think about how the whole value of the company can be transformed by looking at how to basically clean up that Scope 3, see what the business opportunities are, and work out how to do it. That's not going to be possible for all companies, but I think it's something that could be really innovative, particularly in the really energy intensive, carbon intensive, hard to abate sectors actually. So I think fertilizers, steel, things like that.
Okay, and while we're actually talking about what companies can actually do, Mr. Hägglund, given that you, of course, manage this portfolio that gives access to impactful climate projects, can you actually highlight some of the examples of these projects so people who are watching can also be a bit more aware? And how can companies really advertise their support for these in a way that also then doesn't mislead consumers or buyers?
Thanks. I mean, it's really trying to flip the question and say, what can you do with the money you have available, and how can you make as much climate impact as possible with that? Looking at where are the needs of climate finance, and then looking at what is the long-term impact that can have, not just looking at how many tons are removed or avoided today. So it could be financing new carbon removal solutions that are in the lab today, or that needs to be developed and deployed to drop in cost and be part of the big part of the solution by mid-century. But also restore and protect nature, helping grassroots organizations, for example, that are working with regenerative methods and protecting their land. And then decarbonization, both solutions that might not work on the market term yet, but also advocacy and policy projects. Several organizations show that supporting effective advocacy projects can be orders of magnitude cheaper or more cost effective when it comes to actually reducing emissions. So looking for opportunities in these different brackets and trying to find projects where you think that will have a long-term impact. Of course, it's not as easy to communicate as saying that we're carbon neutral when you use this approach and try to support a wide range of projects. But maybe it's two sentences talking about in this way. You can still tie it to your emissions by implementing an internal carbon tax, for example. So Milky Way works with the fintech Klarna that has a carbon tax that they use to generate funds to support climate projects. And then you still have that kind of connection without making any claims about neutrality or compensation.
Mr. Hosleitner, would you like to comment on that?
I think what I find very interesting is it needs to be combined with the internal decision making of the company. So, and also coming back to the carbon market, what you reported, they had some ideas on, okay, you should have an internal carbon pricing. And then I think it's also what Robert just said, okay, and then you come to an amount of emission that you cannot avoid, and you multiply them by 80, 90 euros. And then you have a budget. And with that budget that you can invest. And then you are also a little bit out of this 1 ton for 1 ton. And I think we need to look into this more. And my colleagues at the Director General for Financial Markets, they are working on this sustainability reporting. It's also only first steps on what is done there. But I think they come up with some like fundamentals on separating, okay, what are my own emissions? What are the removals that I buy? What are the offsets that I buy? Do I claim them as offsets? Do I claim them as result-based financing or whatever? But or that it's effective and credible, I think any of these claims must relate to how is the company managed? How does the company manage its carbon emissions? And that must be somehow related to an internal carbon pricing. And then I think, and there's a much higher credibility. I think, but that's of course something to be developed over a decade or several years.
But is that sort of internal decision? I mean, obviously, the European Commission can't legislate for a company's internal decision making. But is there any sort of support that an institution like the Commission can do to help these companies really support their climate actions?
I think as I said, I would hope that like our certification proposal here will already help. What, as I also said, what our colleagues in the Director General for Financial Market are doing will help on the accounting, on all the green claims. What our colleagues in DG Environment and DG Grow are doing on the Sustainable Product Initiative, I think will be very important. And we need to get better at that life cycle analysis. But it's also like they are bringing in also the benefits of carbon removals and so on. So there's a lot of work going on, like the life cycle analysis for construction products. Right? It's a very interesting one. Right? What are the advantages or disadvantages of more woody construction material compared to traditional ones as cement and steel? And how do you find the optimal mix there? So I think this will be all over a very busy space over the next years.
Okay, Melissa, I'll come to you for this one. We've got a question from Pedro Barata. He says, what is an appropriate claim? What is an appropriate use of carbon credits?
Thank you.
Any way to quantify that?
For an appropriate use of claims, well, actually the French Environmental Agency published an analysis last February, where they say that it's actually counterproductive to communicate about carbon neutrality for a company, but you should, instead of saying that, which can be misleading to consumers, you should rather communicate about the actual emission reductions you've achieved for your products or for your company. And that says much more to the consumer, or it's much more transparent than communicating directly on carbon neutrality. And our biggest problem is with the carbon neutrality claims is that it's for a consumer or citizen, it's not very transparent. You don't know what's behind. And actually the focus for companies should be to reduce the emissions as much as possible, and not to use offsets to continue business as usual and claim carbon neutrality. And then appropriate use of offsets for us, indeed, it's clear also in the latest IPCC report that at some point, well, it's a bit of a different issue, but you will need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And in all the sectors of society, there will always be some remaining emissions that are very difficult to abate. These can be offset, but first and foremost, we need to reduce the emissions as much as possible. And some companies have business models that are completely incompatible with a carbon neutral society. And these should never be able to claim they are carbon neutral.
And Bill here, what about if you were to align these claims or climate targets with science? Could that possibly be a better way or better approach for companies?
Yeah, I think it would be. It's actually harder to develop these benchmarks for companies than, oddly enough, for nation states. So, but it is badly needed that there need to be sectoral benchmarks for company activities that result in real emission reductions consistent with getting to net zero.
Could you perhaps give an example of what that could look like, so for people watching, they could sort of understand it?
Well, for example, like you take steel or cement, you could set benchmarks every 5 years for cement production within a given jurisdiction to be meeting so many kilograms of cement per ton of CO2 per ton of cement or per ton of steel, right? And set those benchmarks for those sectors to meet, for those companies to meet, whilst keeping an overall eye on the emission envelope. So that would then provide an incentive for companies to keep investing in reducing the emission intensity of their processes, right? Now, those standards will be different in different countries because each country has its own starting point technologically. So you need to take that into account. Getting towards net zero, everyone gets there at the end, but the 5-year steps are really benchmarks that then you could say, look, your company needs to meet these in the products it does. And then where it gets complicated is aggregating all of these sort of scientifically based benchmarks through supply chains and so on. But I'm sure it can be done. It's setting those benchmarks that we don't really have at present a good way of verifying the benchmarks that have been set. There are some good ones and some that don't seem to work. And I think that's one thing that's needed is some sort of oversight of the benchmark setting, some kind of generally accepted, scientifically robust, legitimized way of setting these benchmarks for companies and sectors so that regulators can sign off on it companies can invest with confidence, and then basically those that are buying from companies know, well, we've bought from a company that's meeting those Paris benchmarks. So I think that's possible. And that's one of the Wild West phenomenon you're talking about now. Many have jumped in with good motives to basically work these out, and then it turns out, well, it's not quite working for different reasons, methodological, political, and I think we need to try and straighten that out, actually, and that's part of what this discussion is about.
Exactly. And so, Mr. Holzleitner, then, your thoughts on this sort of oversight of benchmark setting? Is that something, again, that, you know, where the European Commission could come in?
We have a lot of benchmarks already available from the emission trading system, because the way we give out free allowances, we give it to the best performers in a certain sectors, and we are using these benchmarks. For example, for our innovation fund, where we want to promote those companies that really invest already now into low or zero emission technologies, we use that benchmark. So you must be below that. We also use those benchmarks, for example, for other funds like the Just Transition Fund, like our big recovery and resilience facility. So this is something where we also, like the information that we have, and from the emission trading system, we have a lot of information. We use that also in other Commission policies.
Okay, Mr. Hegland, what then are, you could say, the best practices in corporate target setting and claims, and then how can then companies take responsibility for their indirect emissions?
Well, the best standard, I think, it's the SBTi standard, where it's the strictest, right? Where the SBTi says if you want to have a net zero SBTi target, you need to reduce your emissions with 90% first, and then you can use permanent carbon removal for the remaining 10% to make a net zero claim. But then, of course, there's also a need to finance climate solutions before that, because for a lot of these companies, 90% emission reductions, that's several decades away, and it's also depending a lot because it includes scope 3. So it's very much dependent on the rest of the economy and on lots of other companies to also reduce emissions. So we want companies to support climate projects in the meantime, even if they can't make a claim of being carbon neutral. And all companies might not like that. They might want to have this kind of claim and sort of badge that they can wear. And why would we support any climate projects unless we can claim that we're completely neutral? Unless, so I think we really need to have a shift where it's not that interesting for the companies anymore, maybe to make this climate neutrality claim. And I definitely think we're seeing that now already, where it's, you know, the best that can happen is that people think it's mildly good, but they will also perhaps generate criticisms in the media or from consumers, and that it's much better if companies are more transparent about, one, what they're doing to reduce emissions, as mentioned before, but also what steps are they taking to support climate projects outside the value chain, what steps are they taking to help support policy themselves, are they advocating for the right things, etc. So it's more complicated. It's not the two-word communication, but it's a lot more ambitious, I think, and better for climate.
Okay, well, we're going to go quickly to our second poll now. So ECOS and Carbon Market Watch think, and the question is, I should also say, so please, everyone who is watching, do get ready to answer this question. So ECOS and Carbon Market Watch think that carbon neutrality claims should be banned. So you've heard different things being said today, but these two think that it should be banned. Why do you think such claims might be problematic? And this is a multiple choice question. So 1, they obscure other environmental considerations like water use, single-use plastic, and hazardous chemicals. 2, there's no standard definition of carbon neutrality, so it often isn't clear what it means. 3, they rely heavily on carbon offsets, which are often of low quality. Or last one, all of the above. And I'll give you all a few seconds to think about that and to ponder what the answer could be. And just to give you a little bit of background, as a discussion at European and international level on carbon neutrality and net zero targets is, of course, evolving rapidly, 27 NGOs sought to clarify the European Commission's view on carbon neutrality claims and their potential for greenwashing. They demand that action is taken to regulate green claims and combat greenwashing in ongoing legislative processes, notably that upcoming initiatives on substantiating green claims and strengthening the roles of consumers in the green transition. So what was the correct answer? The correct answer was all of the above. Okay, well, there you go. So that is the results of the poll, and hopefully you can also see that popping up on your screen. Okay, so panelists, I'm now going to go to some of the questions that our audience have been asking, because obviously we are running close to time now. So we've got a question from Clara Carelli. She says, what is your advice for a company that wants to do things in the right way? Scope 3 emissions reductions present big challenges. Would a minimum reduction threshold be a responsible way? And could we consider offsetting as acceptable beyond that threshold? Perhaps Bill, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, look, I think one of the first things a company needs to focus on is reducing its own emissions. I mean, I agree with what Robert said earlier about, you know, a lot of net zero carbon neutral claims are basically out there for advertising reasons, maybe not badly motivated, but that's all they are. And instead, we need to see more realistic approaches from companies, and they should be able to get some credit for serious reductions. So I think that's really important at this stage. I think the complexity of cleaning up scope 3 emissions for a lot of companies means they need to study very carefully how to do it. And they need to make sure that they are really buying into a way of cleaning up the scope 3 emissions that actually do achieve net zero ultimately, and on a Paris compatible time frame. I think that's important. And that's another reason why I think we do need to help companies trying to do that. We do need regulation to basically give confidence to the market. So I think that's really critical.
Okay, Mr. Who should I go to? Holz Lightning, we'll come to you, because I think this is a question perhaps for you more. Daniel Colburn in the chat is writing about advertising authorities and asking if there are legal challenges around greenwashing. So that's definitely something we haven't spoken about. And he says, do you think we need to regulate the specific words that companies use, or are we not allowed to use? And do we need a legal framework focused on advertising and communications? That's a really interesting question there, isn't it?
Yeah, but somehow completely out of my comfort zone. So I don't.
That's why I asked you.
So I don't know whether Melissa or probably you're
yeah,
better
Melissa.
placed.
Okay,
Yes.
Melissa, please go ahead then.
Yeah, I can answer that one. Yes. Do we need a legal framework to, well, around claims? I think yes, definitely. There was, the French government tried to introduce that recently in a climate law. So there was an initial idea to make it illegal to advertise anything around climate neutrality, carbon neutrality, CO2 neutral, zero carbon, so you name it. Claims, yeah, that suggest climate neutrality or carbon neutrality. In the end, the law that was passed in the end does not ban the claims, but to make a claim in advertisement, you need to make available to well, viewers, consumers, a lot of information about your greenhouse gas emissions, the trajectory you are on to reduce your emissions, and also information about the offsets you've used to compensate for your emissions. It's far from perfect. We would have much preferred, or it would have been much better to outright ban the claims through the legislation, but it's not what happened. And now in the EU, we are at a crucial moment where we could actually do something about that. So the DG Justice at the Commission released the Empowering Consumer initiative recently, where, well, there's a proposal to revise a directive on commercial on communication, and there is a mention of climate neutrality claims in the recitals, but not directly in the articles. And so we really much hope that actually the co-legislator will work to strengthen the text, because we really think this is a tool that could be used to ban the claims.
Mr. Housleitner, would you like to comment on that, or really not something you want to comment on? No, not at all. Okay, no worries. Okay, to the next question then. We have.
Can I just give a quick
please go ahead.
Melissa?
Yep. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I'm trying to understand why you want to ban the claims, because you can think out a scenario. Like, I don't think it's the most ambitious or the best way, but I would never want to ban them. So, like, you can think about using renewable energy to power direct air capture, really building that renewable energy in as excess to what's already there, so it doesn't push away steal renewable energy from the grid. And then you do it in a very sustainable way. And if a company wants to say, our products are now carbon neutral, we use this gold standard way, why should that be banned?
Because right now you can make it, well, you can make it a claim without really proving what's behind it. So there's no real framework behind any claim you can make. And if everyone can make the same type of claim, then you cannot distinguish the really good actors from the really bad actors at this point. If there's no way for the public to look at what's behind the claim, and then.
But isn't that what regulation does?
Yeah, it's what it should do. But then I think there's also a nuance to put when it's a company making a claim, having a real pathway to reduce the emissions, and then a claim put on a product or advertisement like our flights, for carbon neutral flights. That I think there's a real problem when those claims are used to encourage consumers to continue business as usual, or consume, to think that there's no need to change your consumption pattern in a way to a climate neutral economy. That's where really we think the problem lies.
No, that's an interesting distinction. Yeah.
Okay, Bill, your thoughts?
Just to jump in, I agree very much here. I think that it would be great to see how a really strong gold standard could be developed for carbon neutral claims. So those claims that are made have really strong backing behind them. They would at first be rare, but they would provide an incentive for companies to move in that direction, and might also begin to draw and make incentives for companies with, let's say, really extensive scope 3 emissions, particularly the big metal companies and so on, to really, follow the lead of some of the leaders. So I think both Melissa and Robert are right. It would be now on Christian's shoulders to come up with a regulatory structure that gives us that gold standard, if I can put it that way.
And when is it coming out? Did you mention it? I'm sitting here wondering.
Bill?
Christian?
I think.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, but I think this should be all as I said, and I think that's an expectation to have such a reporting at the company level. But I think we are still far away from this, and we need a lot of other elements to get there. And I think it will be probably most for my colleagues on the sustainable product initiative, because they can also take maybe a bit of a more global view. What we also touched upon before, it's not only about climate; it's also about other impacts, and it must be something that can be implemented and. I mean, it's overall it's a big claim to be climate neutral, but it's a very powerful one, and I think it's one that has already entered very much also the marketing world and everything. But to give that I think an operational definition on a high quality one we all need to do more work. And I mean, what I also always seen in my smaller area of carbon removals, I think it would be so good to have those best practices, those examples that also policymakers can see this can be done, this can be implemented, and so I think it's a very dynamic space.
Well, Mr. Hansleitner, while we're talking about, what companies can do, gold standards, etc., on the kind of claims that they make, there is a question from Tatiana Lujan. She says, companies many times advertise their future environmental performance and targets, but don't have an implementation plan and budget that can reliably make them meet those targets. So I don't know, how can the EU prevent that, and can consumers take action?
I think there I'm coming maybe on a general level back to what I said before. All these claims can only be credible if they are backed up by an internal carbon accounting and an internal management structure, so that the decisions of the company are guided by the financials, by a carbon price.
Okay, there's another question from Jose Guardiola, and this is the one I think I was about to read out. He says, is there a tool that measures your carbon footprint, scope 1 and 2 at least, developed by the European Commission directly or indirectly? In other words, does the European Commission recommend any carbon footprint measurement tool other than the typical LCA? Thank you. And that would again be from Ms. Holzleitner, I think.
I think this is pretty much what my colleagues, as I said before, in DG Environment and DG Grow are working on with the Sustainable Product initiative, very much with standardization experts at the EU level, at the UN level, to come up there with reliable measurement on life cycle assessment. But again, I'm not the expert on life cycle assessment. I don't know whether Melissa can say more on that or not.
Okay, I can see a question, so I'm going through the questions quite quickly because we are sort of running a little bit out of time, or we're coming close to it. There's a question from Soren Amalang. He says, to all the panelists, oh, I seem to have lost, oh, here it is. Sorry, it keeps jumping up because lots of you are asking questions. He says, when do you expect the first truly climate neutral products in the supermarkets with real net zero supply chains and not just using offsets? Bill, how about I come to you first with that one?
Well, that's a big one. No, I'm not really sure. I don't think we really understand supply chain emissions well enough to give a time frame on that. So in the absence of a good time frame, someone says 10 years, for example. But I think it will really come down to actually whether or not we get the right regulation in place. I just go back to the point that Tatiana made. I mean, I wonder whether the European Commission needs to think about whether corporates need to have really legally binding reports on their emissions. I mean, I just see so many examples of where corporate emission reporting is dubious, manipulated, not complete, designed to make a point rather than actually show what's really happened. And I think in the same way that we might have had that situation in the financial reporting of companies a generation ago, it's been locked down, now you can't do it. You go to jail as a director, then maybe we need to think about that for directors, actually. Some really strong corporate requirements on company reporting above a certain size, so that you've got to really be able to back those reports, because in the end, investors are backing that. And I mean, I do a bit of work with investors in Europe, France, London, Australia, Asia, and they just can't get to the bottom of what's going on with company emission accounts. It's a constant struggle for investors to get that kind of data out of corporates. Maybe it shouldn't be so hard. Maybe there just should be some regulation that really requires that.
Okay, Robert, I'll come to you next. And I also know that you do need to leave in 5 minutes. Are there any sort of, closing final thoughts you want to say? Please do go ahead.
I think I said most of what I think is important. Like like-for-like removals is an important concept. Focusing on impact, not just what happens now, is long-term impact is another. But I really want to know, Christian, when is the regulation coming out? Is there a date? I'm not going to leave this before I have this.
Sorry, I didn't get it before. You meant on the carbon removal certification.
Yeah.
Yes. No, we are still working towards presenting this legal framework by the end of this year.
And the green claims is also, is there a date for that as well?
Maybe Melissa, you know?
No, that's more DG Environment. I think it was planned for the summer, but delayed to the autumn, probably.
All right, thanks. Helpful.
Towards the end of the year. Any other final thoughts about wanting to know when the legislation could possibly come out?
For me, or?
Yeah, Robert, yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, I think I'm all done. I said everything I wanted to say, and I won't repeat myself again. So I think definitely we need to have a race to the top now and show that companies, show the companies what are the most impactful things that they can do, and also give credit to ones that are doing it, so they don't fall into the trap of just having the race to zero and just buying something as cheaply as possible to make a dubious claim.
Okay, thank you so much, and pleasure to have you on the panel.
Thank you very much.
You have to leave, so please go ahead. A pleasure to have you on the panel, Robert Hegland. Okay, so we'll continue. Few final questions, rest of the panelists. We have one from Maddie Horton. She says, carbon neutrality and indeed net zero often misses the importance of methane, and CO2 generally doesn't take account of the increased potency of methane over a 20-year period, the time frame that matters most right now. How can companies and legislators better address methane in standards? Bill, is that something you'd like to take, a question you'd like to take?
I can comment on that. I think that, I mean, in general, accounting should be across all greenhouse gas emissions. And I know there's a lot of discussion about the GWP of methane in 20 years and so on and so forth, and it is really important. But I think you only get a marginal benefit by changing the entire accounting structure away from the 100-year GWP. So by all means, I think that needs to be incorporated in assessments and would provide the justification for tripping one measure over another, for sure. But I think that companies should be really focusing on that. My concern really is the fact that we're now talking about methane again. And from my recollection, it's the third or fourth time in the last 20 years we've talked about methane and nothing happened. Nothing. Zero. We had George Bush the first talk about it. We had George Bush the second talk about it. We had Obama talk about it. We had Clinton talk about it. Now we're doing it again and nothing happened. So I'm really more worried about the fact that nothing happened. And can we actually turn that around now and actually do something about the methane, particularly from the fossil fuel sector, once and for all?
Mr. Holzleitner, would you like to comment?
Yes, I think we are always very careful to talk about climate neutrality and not carbon neutrality. So, and otherwise fully agree with Bill. And yes, we are basing ourselves on the current definitions from the IPCC. And yes, there's an ongoing discussion on the global warming potential, but that must first be solved by the scientists before it would ever be implemented at an operational level.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left. So Melissa, I'll come to you for the final question from our audience. And honestly, thank you so much for all of your questions. They've been really sort of insightful. And I hope that our panelists have been able to answer, give you the answers that you've been looking for as well. So Melissa, this is from Lydia Colas. She says, given some sectors are far more difficult to decarbonize than others, do you think offsets should be equally available across all sectors?
I don't really know, actually. One thing that I think would be fair is that, you know, the sectors that can reduce their emissions to the maximum do so, and the sectors for which it's much more difficult to reduce the emissions in time are prioritized for the offsets. I think you can find a lot of information about that on the IEA Net Zero report, which analyzes where actually the residual emissions in 2050 would be. But whether or not you should allocate the offsets to specific companies, I don't know. And you know, it depends also if you see offsets as purely, you know, nature-based solutions where, well, obviously there's a finite amount of land on Earth, or if at some point we develop very good carbon removal technologies, and that's what you consider as an offset or carbon removal, then it's a bit of a different question.
Okay, lovely. Okay, well, I think it's now time for our sort of final comments. If I could ask all of the panelists to, well, give really your final comments, but also within, I want to come to you with maybe final comments, but also frame it within a final question of sorts. You know, what can we as individuals really do to make sure that we are making sustainable choices and not just being brainwashed by the greenwashing coming from the companies? Bill Hare, if you'd like to go first.
Well, look, I have been discussing what individuals could do for a long time, but I really think what individuals really need to do, and really need to do it well, is vote for the right kinds of governments and insist that government that they voted for develops the regulatory framework for them to be able to take sustainable decisions. I really think people have struggled very hard to do the best in their individual lives, but the whole system change hasn't happened, and that's where we need to see government come in. So that's my perspective on that. Okay,
thank you. Okay, Melissa Zill, your sort of final comments then as well, please.
Yes, actually, I agree. Oftentimes, the burden is put on the individuals, or the individuals feel that they have to, you know, that all of their contributions will make a difference. Well, often it's mostly about decision making and political decisions that really have an impact. And as far as greenwashing and how to, you know, fight greenwashing as a consumer, I'd say there's lots of resources out on, you know, where as an individual your impact is the highest. So, you know, get informed and not just believe advertisement and corporate communication.
Thank you so much. Okay, Christian Holzleitner, your sort of last thoughts and what you think individuals can do to make sure that they're not being taken in by all the greenwashing that is unfortunately around us right now.
Maybe, like as every company, also we as consumers, we should first think about our scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, and see what we can do better in our choices. And I think there are some obvious ones, like which fuel do we use for heating, which type of cars are we driving, and I think that goes without any claims on climate neutrality. But then, of course, I think what consumers also expect more and more, and I think it's not only consumers, it's equally the investors, and I think that's more to companies, is to be honest about the value chain, to be honest about the impact on the climate, on the environment, and I think that will become a much bigger topic over the next years. And I don't think that there's a one big bang solution to that, but I think the proposal that this Commission has come out with and will continue to come out with over the next year, I think are very essential steps in the right direction.
And do you think that the Commission, just one final question, do you think that you feel that the approach the Commission will take will be the right approach and the best approach for now, at least?
I guess on that question, I can only say yes.
Yeah, of course. Okay, well, listen, thank you all so much. And we're going to have to leave it there. So to Bill Hare, Christian Holzleitner, Robert Hägglund, and Melissa Zill, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to have been having this debate. I think it's been a very different sort of angle or approach on this idea of greenwashing, on climate neutrality, and to everyone who is, of course, joining us online, who's put those questions in, had your questions answered. You know, I really hope that today's debate has really given you a flavour of the sort of debate surrounding carbon neutrality. I'm Rome Zaidi, and you've been watching a debate co-hosted by ECOS and Carbon Market Watch. And don't forget that this recording will be made available online. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.